Ego, the pinnacle of humanity, the greatest birthright we possess, and at the same time, the source of all suffering. My first foray into religion, Buddhism, taught me that ego must be dissolved or that it must be somehow subdued. And unless this separate sense of self were eliminated, it would be infinite cycles of reincarnation into lives of suffering. So I struggled for years with the idea that the ego was the problem and it was something to be denied. I would go through bouts of non-attachment to the ego, but somehow I was always flung back on myself as if resisting it made it stronger. Then, the first time I did plant medicines, it seemed that I had a breakthrough. Everything became so clear that I had finally solved the great riddle. And although I couldn't put it into words, it didn't matter. In that moment, I knew that I had defeated the ego and all of the suffering along with it. Revelations that I could have never come up with in a million years by myself became so clear to me. But everything that goes up must come down. So here I was, back to the grounded reality with profound realizations, but I still had the same vices, desires, and passions. It was in a sense even more confusing than before because it's as if I actually obtained something during these trips only to realize that I didn't really possess anything more than before. So what did the illuminating messages amount to? Why weren't they able to help me in my everyday life? I mean, these were ultimate truths that dissolved my separation from the whole and into unity with the all. So then I tried to ignore, busy myself with worldly pursuits, and forget about overcoming this seemingly impossible obstacle. But something kept calling. So now I'm back on the search, and I don't have all the answers, but I do know this. The ego doesn't simply die, it's transmuted. And it's not so much about dissolution as it is about transformation. And there is one spiritual master who accomplished this when he carried his own cross for crucifixion. Not only did he die for the people of the past, but he did so for the people of the future. Yeah, he was preparing for the future when humanity would have to give up their crowning jewel and transcend the ego. Buddha, as we know, came about 600 years before Christ. Back then, they had clairvoyant consciousness, but they lost it as we descended into materialism. Gautama Buddha, the prince, was a bodhisattva before he was a Buddha. And he went out of his kingdom, he saw death, disease, and old age. At first, he couldn't understand it with his divine wisdom because he had the wisdom of a bodhisattva. But in the face of materialism and death, he couldn't hold the two facts together. Death, disease, and old age, he saw, took the human being more powerfully, and the wisdom was actually useless in the face of it. Therefore, he came up with his grand teaching about the thirst for existence, or what we call desire. This desire, therefore, had to be escaped. We have to remove ourselves from this cycle of pain and inevitable suffering. As I was discovering this Buddhist literature in college, I thought it made so much sense. I could clearly see how this principle of suffering could apply. If you want something but you can't get it, you suffer. If you also suffer if you get something that you don't want. And let's say you do get the thing that you want, well, how long is that going to last? It's all governed by time, so eventually that will end, and once again, suffering. And all the popular Alan Watts, Ram Dass made it even more alluring to buy into. For the first time, I felt that I had something that amounted to higher knowledge. And there was a clear goal to break attachments to everything, including the ego. And this was all very exciting. I dove headfirst into all the Eastern literature and videos I could find on Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Hinduism, etc. But as I walked this path, I kept hitting a wall. Satori enlightenment was supposed to be sudden, but I could never non-identify with the ego. It was on the one hand a lofty goal that I wanted to achieve so bad, and on the other hand, I was at times so far from that goal that aspiring to achieve enlightenment seemed ridiculous. And I tried, struggled, and every time if I ever achieved any form of non-attachment with the ego and its devices, it was always met with an equal or greater force in an unwanted direction afterwards, as if it were like the physics of like action and reaction. So I was brought up in a Christian church, which I rebelled against during my teenage years. The way that it was presented in church was that God was an irrefutable and omniscient authority that must be worshipped with blind faith. And in retrospect, it probably wasn't that bad, but the teenage rebellious streak was strong with me. Suffering, in a Christian sense, is because of sin, and regular sin is attributed to original sin. So, in a way, there's a karmic aspect to the Christian conception of suffering. But suffer as we may in life, we do so because we know one day we'll be saved in heaven. Now, that's the exoteric teaching. But the esoteric aspect of this is that heaven is not some faraway place that one ascends to after worldly death. No, Jesus said, the kingdom is here on earth. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, if we say suffering is because of sin, and that goes all the way back to original sin, what was the original sin? The original sin was that humans ate from the tree of knowledge. What does that entail? The tree of knowledge gave humans the awareness of themselves as separate from the whole, a sense of individuality, as an ego. Separating oneself from the pure divine light to experience oneself as a separate ego was essentially to be a god. But with this power came freedom, and with freedom came the freedom to err, to do wrong. See, before that, we were entirely divine spiritual beings, but we had no possibility to err. So in a sense, it wasn't worth much because it was spiritual automatically. We had to experience ourselves as separate, as an egoic being, so that we could experience freedom and have free will and choice. So now we suffer because of this original sin of basically having an ego and going too far with it. And the esoteric aspect of Christianity is that we now have to transform the ego. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The godly essence had descended to earth, but now on earth, we must raise it back up. Contrast this with Buddhist thought, where Buddha saw suffering as a result of the thirst for existence. His whole conception was how to eliminate this, which is based on a negation. The Christian conception is take this suffering and transform it, raise it back up. But raise back up to what? Transform this suffering, which is the result of the ego, into what? When Buddha came into the world, before Christianity's, humans had fallen, meaning it was at a time that they lost the spiritual connection and they descended into materialism. As you can imagine, the people during that time longed for their lost connection. And due to the fact that they could only perceive matter, they rejected it outright. They said all is Maya, but they couldn't get back to their spiritual connection. And I never understood the concept of Maya, the illusion of everything, including the illusion of the ego and self, until I did psychedelics. For me, psychedelics always goes one of two ways. I'm either intensely fascinated with the perception of things around me, which is a very contemplative thing, or I'm entirely submerged in what it is I'm doing. One of them is more of an observing and the other is more of a doing. And in the observing state, I found that if I could tap into any sort of phenomena, and depending on how in tune I was at that moment, I could see a certain reality behind that phenomena. And if I contemplated the ego during these trips, I had the sense that Tim didn't exist at all. The sense of self was completely non-existent. That's why looking at a mirror is so strange and so laughable. At once, I understood all of the Eastern spiritual literature and Taoist Buddhist texts on enlightenment. In that moment, I was more or less non-identified with any ego or even attachment to worldly things. The best way I could describe it is that I was me, but I was not identified with being me. I was moving around using this physical body, but only as a tool or an instrument. And once this relation to the body is established, the sense of me being somebody, Tim, started to drop away. But even though it dropped away when I was done tripping, it came back every time, like clockwork. So just like psychedelics aren't a permanent solution for me, neither is ego death permanent. The death of the ego, these mini episodes, are an illusion because the ego is meant to be transformed. Just like psychedelics give you the illusion of higher power, mini revelations. And so the Buddhist conception is that suffering is endless, so you must eliminate yourself from the cycle. But the Christian conception is that suffering is inevitable, so you must transform it. Be reborn and make it into something new for yourself. But in fact, yourself doesn't exist as the same thing. In the esoteric teaching of Christ, reincarnation is actually a crucial part. Christ taught reincarnation in the Bible, but it's very subtle. People weren't supposed to know about it in the time after the death of Christ. Since people were descending into materialism, they needed to live and experience their life fully in one incarnation. In this way, humanity would obtain what the material world could teach them, which is death on the physical plane. Jesus said, "Elias has come again, but don't let them know until I come again." He told his closest disciples on the Mount of Tabor, which is also the mountain of transfiguration, but the real teaching was that Christ would come again, transformed. Christ would indeed come again, but not in a material body. And this is proof of his greatest spiritual teaching, which is overcoming death, death of the physical body and the ego. And now this is the time where we have gained everything there is to know about materialism. I mean, think about it. We're fully steeped in it. Until I learned about spirituality, I didn't have a sense of my divine nature, nor did I sense the spirit around me, and I definitely did not feel myself to be an important link to the eternal cosmos, even with all the Christian upbringing. But I consider myself fortunate now, because if in this incarnation I'm finally coming around to this truth and feeling it more and more, it means that I prepared in my past life, and the result is that now I'm drawn to this, right? So if any of you are also drawn to this knowledge, consider yourself blessed, for these are the fruits of your labors in past lives. And everything that now permeates your thoughts, feelings, and actions become the seeds for your next incarnation. This was the esoteric teaching of Christ. We once fell from a higher spiritual state, and having entered into this condition, we must rise again. And we can't do this through our own ego, but through a power that can enter our being, lifting us above that ego which we now have. This transformation can happen when the Christ impulse is once more active within, leading us out of the illusion of matter and into the perception of true reality. Ever upward, until even those forces which bring sickness and death upon our material body can be vanquished and conquered by that higher spiritual power of the Christ impulse. And this is not a knock against Buddhism and Buddha, which was indeed a divine being that came and gave humans higher knowledge. And you can even say that the deed of Buddha made the Christ event possible. But with the Christ event, the crucifixion, humanity has to come to realize that it's not release and freedom from the cycle of reincarnation that we should seek, but resurrection. Because this transfiguration of the earthly being is the means by which we find the inner meaning of material life.